Hi, everybody. Welcome to DevOps Day Buffalo. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're listening to my talk today. I'm here to talk to you about databases and the trends that are going to transform, or in some cases, even break your infrastructure. And before we begin, let me introduce myself. I am Matt Yonkovit. I am the head of open source strategy at Percona, or the Hoss for short. You can find me on Twitter. You can email me at hoss@percona.com. Or you can check out my podcasts, which focus on open source and open source databases. Just search for the Hoss Talks Foss. We've got about 45 episodes now, so all kinds of awesome goodness there. But let me start with talking to you about a little bit of a trend here. Many of you may say this all the time. Maybe you've heard this from developers. Maybe this is your philosophy. Databases are so boring. They are. They're boring. They're dull. They're not cutting edge. They're just kind of a necessity. People don't necessarily like them. This is a thought process that I hear over and over again, especially from developers, right? They don't want to think about it. Databases have become this commodity, just like a lot of our infrastructure. And, here's the thing. Thank God they're boring. Boring databases are good. Seriously, let me tell you why this is a good thing that your databases can be boring and you have that opportunity. First of all, there are some things in life that should never be exciting, right? Some things like plane trips or taxes or a doctor's visit. These are things that if you come back from a plane trip and your spouse says, "How was that plane trip?" and you say, "Wow, that was an exciting plane trip." Generally, something bad happens. Not always, but that's not generally a good thing. When you go to your accountant and you say, "Wow, that was an exciting trip to the accountant," not a good thing. Same thing with the doctor. Nobody wants to go to the doctor's office and gets that really exciting, doctor's visit there. Just not something that you want to do generally. So this kind of leads into this first trend that we're seeing as databases become more commoditized, as they become more ubiquitous across the industry. There's a philosophy from a lot of people that the easiest thing they can do is just ignore the databases, just use the default, and they implement this strategy of trust and hope. That is not a strategy, okay? Now, databases are uncool. They're not as cutting edge as some of the new technologies, although there are some really interesting, cool databases out there. But I'm a database nerd, so take it with a grain of salt. But a lot of developers don't want to think about that data. Okay. And in fact, their managers don't want to think about it. Developers, managers think about code. They think about the application. They think about feature set. Infrastructure applications, or infrastructure and databases, not so much. They just want it to be there. And it's kind of like the plumbing in your house, right? If you're building a house, if you've got a house, I'm sure you all have a house, you probably have a bathroom. I'm pretty sure that, 100% of you probably have a bathroom somewhere. And, you probably don't think a lot about the plumbing or the toilet, do you? No. You just assume it's going to work when you need it. Right after that trip to the, to your favorite restaurant that has that spicy food, you assume that it's going to be there. But you think about it when you need it the most. And when things go wrong, that's when you're really interested in it. So when you think about databases, yes, they can be boring. Yes, you want to make them to the point where you don't have to think about them. But when you have to think about them, who do you call? Who is your expert? Who knows the databases inside and out? And, what sort of tools and processes do you have in place to manage when you have that bad day, right? So who are you going to call in those situations? And this is where you need to make sure that you have the capabilities to manage and monitor those systems. So when you do have that hour a week, when you do need to care about the databases, you can make it as easy and smooth as possible. Boring is good, right? It's a great thing. but it takes a lot of work to make those databases boring. You have to be afraid of those exciting ones. So make sure you have the environment set up and everything in place for when it does get maybe on the cusp of getting exciting. Because you really have to understand, no matter how boring we make it, how much automation we put in place, outages, slowdowns, and security issues do happen. And you need to make sure you have planned for those and you bake those into whatever your strategy is. Now, because of all of this and because of the desire to be boring, right? You want to move things to a database as a service. A lot of people do out there. A lot of people are thinking, how can I make this someone else's problem? How do I get out of the habit of having to think about or care about, some of those underlying issues, right? So move it to someone else, make it someone else's problem. Pick your favorite cloud provider, move it over. It's all going to be good. Well, here's the thing. It's about passing the buck, and, that boring thing, you want someone else to make it boring so you don't got to worry about it. So make the maddening issues. And there's a very compelling, use case for this, right? I mean, think about it. All the marketing material for your favorite cloud providers probably talk about things like focus on innovation, not on the infrastructure. Focus on your feature set, your code. That's what you want to do. Reduce your costs, scale up quickly. So easy to manage. That's right. So all of these things are the promise that's out there. But here's the thing that we found is, while it does reduce a lot of those issues that you would normally see, it doesn't eliminate them. Because what you have to understand is, if you have a good foundation of the house, that's one thing. But if you design the house to be less than optimal, you can still have issues. Same thing in the database space. We do a survey every year. And what we found was that 66% of people running their database as a service still have performance problems, still have slowdowns during the year. That's a lot of people. Why? Well, application design, making sure that the database is designed for the workload, making sure that the database as a service is optimized for that workload. Those aren't things that most cloud providers help with. It's a shared responsibility model. They give you the tools. It's up to you to know how to use them and implement them. That's an important distinction, and you need to make sure that you are aware of that. Now, we also see that there's a lot of outages. What? How can these big companies have outages? It happens more than you would think. Go out there and just Google for cloud outage. You'll probably find that there are several major outages in any given year. But outages are not just outages from a cloud provider perspective. Okay, this is an important thing because actually, while those do happen, they are rare. I mean, 5-6 times a year. It's still more than we would like, and they're generally regionalized. But when they happen, those are really bad days for everybody. Those are those exciting days you want to plan for. But when you do have outages that are more frequent, typically it is caused by something that is application related, and that interaction between the database and the application side. So how do you optimize that? How do you make sure that you've got that, ready to go? Because in the eyes of a users, if your database and your application is so slow they can't get it, it's an outage, even if it's up and running. Big distinction there. Also, 18% of people who are running the database as a service reported higher than expected costs. Some cases way higher, because they don't think about that database design. They don't think about those other activities, so they scale by credit card. Hey, oh my God, I'm having some issues. What am I going to do? Go to the next instance size. Still having issues? Go to the next instance size. And when you do that, you quickly run out of money. Just being honest. Now, part of this movement to be boring, okay, is being driven by slightly different, mindsets. What you have to understand is currently we are in a space where we now have distributed control of your stacks. So decisions on technology are no longer necessarily controlled by one department or one group. This is an important distinction, and it is something that is moving the whole industry in new directions that we might not expect. So we've found, and this is something that I've seen in many other studies, that right now developers and architects are charged with moving more quickly and more efficiently than ever before. It's about getting feature set, getting new applications to market, trying to monetize before someone else does. And that means a lot of the decisions on infrastructure, what technologies, what stack they use, are often pushed down to those individuals or those groups. And so this has led to kind of a interesting proliferation of technologies across the industry. Because from a database perspective, let's just focus on the database, which is what we're talking about. It used to be that you would pick, hey, someone would decide we're an Oracle shop and everything was on Oracle. Now you've got 10 different groups and one prefers Oracle, one prefers MySQL, one prefers Postgres, one prefers Mongo, one prefers Redis. And you have all of these different technologies. And so you're no longer just like a lamp stack. You're a lamp and a mean and a elk and a everything else stack. And that means more of everything, right? More database technologies, more languages to support, more tools, more infrastructure components. And don't forget, do it all faster and cheaper, right? Because we're always getting those pushed down to do faster and cheaper. But as we see this expansive list of technologies start to grow in every company, we're seeing that the infrastructure teams, those who are doing a lot of the DevOps work, they're responsible for doing more with less. So their teams don't, they might get 10 times the number of technologies to support, but their teams don't grow 10x. And so do more with less, do it faster, do it cheaper. And now you've got this complex ecosystem. And of course, a lot of this is also driven by the need to go cloud native. Now, this is not a new trend. This is something that's been happening for a while. But you have to understand that from a cloud native perspective and a database perspective, this is a newer trend that's evolving. Not many people a couple years ago would run their databases in a containerized setup or in Kubernetes. Now we're seeing that number is way higher. More people are exploring this because, again, from a development and an application team, that's how they run their applications. That's how they run their code. That's how they deploy. They want to deploy and use databases the same way. And every microservice, every little tiny component now wants their own database. So now not only do we have massive lists of technology that we need to support, now we need to do it across massive amounts of individual databases and individual database components. So how do we manage that herd? That herd is an important thing to manage and understand. And that means you need the proper tools and observability set up before you start to deploy these en masse. Of course, because we just want more. At the same time, we hear those buzzwords, AI, machine learning, everything else out there. And from a standpoint, those are all awesome things, but they're also a giant sink of space, right? There is no management team right now that's looking at reducing the amount of data they have. They want to increase it. They might want to archive it. They want to put it on cheaper storage, but we're digital pack rats now. We want data forever because we might be able to figure out a way to monetize it later on. And so that means we need more space. So more technologies, more databases, more space. Whoa. But this is a little illogical because remember one of the other things that I said, everybody wants things faster and they want it cheaper. So if you're going to store more is harder to manage. More is harder to, maintain. It costs more to store more. It's slower when you're accessing more stuff. So you've got this nexus, if you will, of complex systems with multiple technologies, with lots of storage, with lots of different databases. And so and at higher costs, all of these things are kind of colliding all at once. And as they collide, one of the things that we see is that you're responsible now for figuring out how to make them all work together. And so new technologies come out and make the problem a little bit bigger, right? So let's add this technology component on top of this one, to manage the complexity. It's a difficult situation, but figuring out how to manage that complexity is critical to the next generation of infrastructure and DevOps folks. Now, couple that with, not everyone's running the exact same versions of the software that you have in your data center. So we've seen this with a lot of enterprises. A lot of enterprises are adopting an open source program office. They're looking to adopt more open source code. They're looking to contribute more open source code. What we've found is that, especially in the larger companies, there are a lot of larger companies who are taking popular open source software and building their own versions. This means that the tooling you might rely on might not work 100%. This also means that getting support from an upstream vendor or bug fixes might not work 100%. So as you start to see this complex environment continue to grow and get more complex, now we're going to throw in the things that you think you might have a handle on. Maybe you don't. And so that's something that we also need to be mindful of, that as you start to adjust and alter open source to include different patches and functionality, if you're going to run your own fork, you're going to run your own branch, that is a costly thing. And so it is better if you can contribute the code upstream and get it included in the upstream product. So then that way you don't have to worry about the maintenance of that particular build. Now, one of the other things that we've got going on here is, with this complexity and with this automation and with pushing down the responsibility of owning and starting up those instances and configuring them, we've kind of moved away from the DBA as a role. So in the past, DBAs have been responsible for things like building databases, setting them up, helping make sure that the configuration is there. There was a lot of mundane work. Now, thankfully, we're automating a lot of that away, or you're using a database as a service. There's lots of different things, but these DBAs now are becoming product managers or SREs, right? So as the automatic, operations start to occur, which is great because you have to do that at scale, we're now pushing down and making a, kind of a microscope on some of the issues that can't be automated, like the performance tuning, like the database design. These are things that it's really difficult to automate because it depends on the workload. It depends on, the application development. And so we haven't, completely automated away our application development yet. And now we're seeing a lot more of the job of the DBAs is to build the automation, first of all, that supports kind of their own internal database as a service or their company's, automation as a service. And then also take that and become SREs for when those components, the needle in the haystack, has a problem. How do you find it and how do you, fix it? So it's an important role. A lot of SREs, a lot of folks in this space need those database skills because you're going to have to deep dive into the database, but it might only be 1 or 2 times a week. So something to keep in mind. Now, the other big thing that you can't, go through your newsfeed without seeing is database breaches, hacks are up and they're at an all-time high, right? And there are so many people who are giving away their data for nothing. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned this complex environment, more, and managing more is difficult. But I also mentioned that we're pushing down responsibility for setting up databases and making sure that they're configured and, decisions on which databases to use down to developers. And most of the database breaches that we see are actually caused by very easy things that most DBAs or most database professionals who have been in the industry for a long time would fix. Things like, hey, why don't we set a password? I mean, I think everybody should know that now, but you would be amazed how many people just click the button on some, cloud instance or, do a Docker container to bring up a database and leave everything as default, load up all your production data, do some analysis, forget about it, leave it out there, and someone goes and hacks it. Happens way too often. In fact, when I looked a year ago, 50% of the data breaches were caused by that, right? By that lack of basic 101 security. And as we give more people access who don't have that skill level, we need to put in the guardrails to protect our infrastructure from the least skilled developer, right? Anybody can have a bad day. Anybody who is moving fast is going to miss steps. So part of that automation, part of the things that we're doing has to be to protect people from those issues. Now, of course, there are companies out there who are willing to help you with those problems. But I'm an open source guy. So let me talk a little bit about open source. Big money has really entered into the open source space. And now we're seeing that, this is something that's going to impact you, someone who's trying to build out the infrastructure and build out, our applications of the future. Because you're going to, more and more we see that people are relying on open source. But we're also seeing that the values of a lot of open source companies are shareholder first, not user first. And that means that from a shareholder perspective, okay, your priorities might not be theirs. Their priorities are shareholder value, how to increase their reoccurring revenue. And how they do that might be make you pay more money or have you get locked in. And there are companies who leave pain points in or have pain points that are only solved by paying them more money. You have to be mindful because we're in a situation where, that type of stuff happens. And part of that is the lock-in thing. And, lock-in's kind of an overblown term. You hear it quite a bit. You're going to lock into a technology when you start writing in it. But vendor lock-in is a little weird. And let me tell you a little bit about why you should care. Okay. So when I talk about this type of lock-in, it really drives back to that big money in the open source space. So pick your favorite open source technology. Okay. You go out, you implement it, you use it without paying anyone, without talking to anybody in sales, without signing a contract, without having a license. You go, you start developing on it. That's great. You put a lot of time and effort into it. You start to build out what you need. Now, let's say you at some point need some features. And, in the open source space, what we've seen is a lot of larger companies will implement those features for themselves, or they might, pay someone to, implement it for them. But when you start to build in, like those features that are only in a paid for version, it's really hard to sometimes get out. And from a market perspective, we've seen that many vendors are starting to change their licenses to be less open. And everyone's trying to vie for the minds and the hearts of your developers, so they'll choose their technology. Because once they pick that technology, it's really hard to unwind. In fact, I've used this quote quite often when we talk about database vendors. This is a quote from an analyst who is, following the big money, and he talks about switching vendors, and he talks about how risky it is and how this is a great business model. And this was actually talking specifically about MongoDB, but because it's just like Oracle in the 90s. Right. And Oracle in the 90s, I was around, they didn't have a great reputation because they did all kinds of shenanigans to get more money out of you. So this is something that shareholders look at. Ooh, look, we can generate recurring revenue and we can keep it. That's what they want. And it's important for them. And you don't have to look just to the software space. Look at real world examples. Ice cream. Who doesn't like ice cream here? Now, who hasn't gone to McDonald's and said, I want an ice cream cone or I want a milkshake? And then they say, we're sorry, our machine is down. Now, Wire did this great article that kind of explores this. And the reason they did this article is it turns out there is one company who is responsible for fixing McDonald's ice cream machines. And they have a contract with McDonald's. And that contract means anytime that there is any issue with that machine, you have to call that, vendor, even if it's a minor issue. Well, one enterprising, few folks at a McDonald's found that there's actually a secret code, a Konami code, to go in and fix minor issues within the machine. Because a lot of times it's just like, oh, the temperature got out of whack. So instead of being, 30 degrees, it's 35 degrees. So it's coming out too melted. You need to reset it. And so, instead of paying this huge fee to this company and going out there to, having them to wait 3 days without an ice cream machine, somebody built an app that allows you to go into the Konami code and say like, oh, let's reset that temperature. Let's reset the consistency. And McDonald's and this company sued them because they want it to be so you can only use this one company whenever you want to do anything. That type of lock-in is real, and it exists in the software space as well as in the McDonald's space. So you have to be careful of that because you never know what sort of, lock-in you're going to get and how it's going to impact the future of how your company evolves. So that's what I had to share with you. Thank you for listening. I hope you learned some interesting things about, how infrastructure is changing and some of these trends and why you should be careful of them.